Is this the most studied rook endgame in the history of chess? Well, no, we know it's not. We know that this is arguably the most studied rook endgame in the history of chess. I've already made 6 videos pretty much on this position, or very slight variants of it. And this original position I just started this video with is also, I guess, a variant of it. You can see the similarity straight away. We've got a bunch of pawns on the king side, and we've got our white rook stuck behind a passed rook's pawn on the other side. Now, this sort of position hasn't been studied historically. There's a lot less of it in the chess literature. It was all about this position. So it's worth sort of doing a reminder of, like, why was it this position? Why is this wave formation been the one that's historically studied? What's so good about this wave formation in particular for the defending side? Why does it help black defend? So it's worth doing a reminder of that before we then get back to this position, where we can see black's not been able to achieve that, so that white's got this extra space on the king side, which at first you'd think, okay, well, that's great. That means that white's got a big advantage now, and surely it's a win. But we're going to see, surprisingly, that black's got a very simple yet only recently discovered drawing technique, which we're going to see played expertly in this 2017 game. But yeah, let's do a quick reminder then of this wave formation. The first thing I think is worth talking about is how it's not to be confused with this different position, just a simple 4-on-3 majority on the king side. We covered this in, I think I did about 3 videos on this sort of stuff. And how does white win this? Well, they've got to create a passed pawn. Okay, that's the only way white's going to win this, is to create a passed pawn. This position's almost certainly a draw. You know, if well, it's definitely a draw with correct play by black. But if white was going to try and win it, they want to create a passed pawn, so they want to get their pawn up to e6. But the problem with that is that black just takes it, which means we will need a pawn on f5 to take back. So we need to put a pawn on f5. But the problem with that is that black just takes it, so we will need a pawn on g4 in order to take back. So if black's got any sense, they will play h5, so that when we put our pawn on g4, they will just take it, and we will need a pawn on h3 to take back. And by the time all of that creation of the passed pawn has gone on, it's just a solitary passed pawn on e6, by which time black's going to have their king on e7, e8, and they're going to have a very simple Philidor, Klingenhorwitz drawn position. So that's why in this position black plays h5. That's what the wave formation is for here. So I reckon don't confuse why we want the wave formation in this position with that simple pawn majority on the king side. Although it's also for that reason. Okay, if the white pawn had gone to the 7th rank and our rook was stuck in front of it, what white wants to do, the only way that white's going to win that, is they've got to bust the black king out into the open, so that either it gets checked or we do the skewer idea. If the black king was on f7, rook h8 is going to be the thing that wins it. So the whole need to create a passed pawn is still there, and the wave formation guards against that quite nicely. Remember that if all the kingside pawns were missing and white had a passed g pawn, then black would just stick their king on g7 and ignore it. And if white had a passed h pawn, black would just stick their king on h7 and ignore it. If you had a passed f pawn, black can't just stick their king on f7 and ignore it, because of the skewer idea. Okay. Now all of that's still going on, but even if there are other kingside pawns around, it's not quite as simple as saying it's definitely a draw to do that, but it more or less is. I mean, there's other stuff going on. If you remember, plan 1 is to sacrifice the a pawn for the swapping of rooks, and then maybe get into a one king and pawn ending. So it's, if there are other kingside pawns around, I can't be just sort of dogmatic and say, oh yeah, if you create a passed g pawn, it's definitely useless or whatever, but it probably is. So this wave formation is nicely set up so that if white pushes their pawn to the 7th rank, there's no way that they're going to be able to create that passed f pawn. And in fact, it's also nicely set up so that if white ever pushes their pawn to the 7th rank, the f pawn's given the king shelter from that check that white would want to play. White wants to play a check and then a8 equals queen, so f6 is a nice place for the black king to be. And g7, so that the black king can just sort of sit there quite happily. If the white pawn's on a7, it's a cast iron draw. And it's because it's such an easy draw for black that we don't put the pawn to a7. We leave the pawn back on a6 so that we've got shelter in there for the king. And then this position's very, very complicated because the general dynamic going on is that the only way that white can make progress is their king's got to come over. But as soon as that happens, they start dropping pawns. And it's all about can black create a drawn version of rook versus pawn by getting some activity going on the king side, whilst before they have to sack their rook for the a pawn. And we've made 6 videos on that. And so, for example, king d4, we've learned that rook takes f2 is a losing move. So what black has to do in this position is g5. So here we see another sort of reason for that wave formation, is that in this pawn setup, if white hasn't pushed their pawn to the 7th rank, then black can get going straight away. It's all about the active king, and that will lead to a draw, that g5 move. And it's, it's deep. There's been a lot of analysis on it. So that's why historically, as far as I can tell, this was the position studied. I think they might have got confused historically with, we know why we want the wave pawn formation there. There were lots of sensible reasons to have it here as well. But it's not all about stopping white creating a passed pawn in this setup, where the white pawn is the extra one on this, or with the extra passed pawn on the queen side. We've got all the other stuff going on, particularly in the, can the white king get over here, do the necessary damage to win the black rook and get back in time to win that rook versus pawn. It's deep, there's a lot of stuff going on, but that's historically why it was never studied. So in this 2017 game, as far as I can tell from the Dvoretsky book, is that they just sort of believed that because white's got lots of space here, for example, here, this g5 move was that was the defensive strike, because black's got a bit of space. It's activate the king, get a bit of space, and get that king and pawns moving, so you can create that drawn version of rook versus pawn. Here, black's stuffed on that front. Like there's just not really any way to get anything going. White's got the space. They sort of clamped down on black on the king side, so it looks bad, right? But it's okay. And the play with the black pieces in this 2017 game demonstrated a drawing technique that, I guess we should be on the lookout for in our games. So, yeah, rook d3 check. That's a sort of a fairly obvious move you'd want to play first of all, hoping for a king g4 walking into a checkmate, which would be quite nice, but obviously I think you'd be lucky if anyone played that against you, let alone a titled player. So yeah, king g2, and we're going to play h5 anyway. Sadly, it's not a checkmate, but it is fixing the white h pawn, which in some circumstances can actually be something you can go after. For example, I think if king f2 in this position, I haven't got that as prep, but I think because this pawn's still got 3 squares to go, I think you can just play rook h3 there. King f2, yeah, rook h3, top move. Okay, so you can come and snatch the white h pawn. So this h5 fixes the white h pawn. Now in the game, white used the opportunity of their a pawn not being attacked to just free up the rook c7 straight away. But what happens if they play a6? Okay, just get on with pushing that pawn and just sort of say, well, it's the same position as the most studied rook endgame in the history of chess, but white hasn't got the wave formation. But I don't care about that because it's an advantage for me as white to not have the wave formation because I've got all this space on the king side. So we'll see about that. So yeah, just push the a pawn. By the way, a reason that white might want to push the a pawn is another reason they might want to do it is if in the game, for example, rook c7 was played and then black just brought their rook behind the a5 pawn, and this forced white to defend it. And they wanted to defend it laterally. Otherwise, if they wanted to defend it back on a7, why bring their rook out in the first place? And this is now just a draw, which we'll go through in a minute. We'll go through what happened in the game. King f8, and I mean, I'll come back to this position in a minute. But if we had this position one rank further up, sort of thing, this is not a draw. Okay, so this is why white wants their pawn on a6 with their rook defending it laterally. Because let's say black gets on with the same moves that got them the draw in the game, so king f8, white can just bring the king over. Black king e7, the black king gets active, king d7, but this is the killer blow, rook f6. And you'd think that black's got to do something about their e-pawn, come back and defend it. I suppose they can defend it indirectly with king d8 or something like that, because then if the pawn doesn't fall with check, then they can take the a-pawn. But I mean, the engine's just got this as +5 now, and the white king's just going to come over. This rook's just doing a fantastic job of just defending everything, and you can see that black has not got time now to collect the h-pawn. So this is why white wants their pawn on a6, and if they could get that set up, they've won. So it's pretty important that that black prevents that. Something I found a bit confusing actually in the Dvoretsky endgame manual is that he says that the player with the black pieces found this brilliant new drawing technique, this simple drawing technique, but it's only demonstrated in the line where white would now play a6. And now we're about to see this brilliant drawing technique. But in the game, white didn't play a6. White played rook c7. And so I'm a bit confused as to how this particular game has demonstrated to this world this new drawing technique, because it wasn't in the game. It was a slightly different what to do if white doesn't play a6. But anyway, let's see what happens if white plays a6. And it is so simple. It's very elegant. You just do a sort of a Vancouver like. You just attack the a-pawn laterally. White might think to bring their king over, king f3, but you just shove your rook on e6, and the white king is shut out the game. The white rook is tied down to defending the a-pawn. We know that if white advances that pawn to a7, then we're back to the rook in front of a 7th rank pawn, and that is just the cast iron draw. So easy to draw that. We'll see that in a variation in a minute. What does white do? What does white do? If they try and wait with king f2, we just do nothing with our king. We've got to defend our f7 pawn, obviously, because the rook's hitting it. But yeah, we just do nothing. If they if white does nothing with rook a8, I mean, I suppose they're not completely doing nothing. We also just do nothing still. King h7. We don't, obviously we can't go to g8 anymore, but we don't need to defend the f7 pawn. This king will always have a move, and we can just leave our rook on e6. If the a pawn is pushed, draw. And I mean, what does white do? The only way really to try and make progress is to play f5. Takes king f4, king back to g7. King takes f5, rook e1, and I mean that comes off the a pawn. But if white uses the opportunity to get out their rook, we can just stay on the a pawn, go and nab black's h pawn, and we're going to end up with a drawn version again of rook versus pawn. This is a nice little finish actually. So rook h6 to stop our h-pawn, check, cut the king off, defend the h-pawn, a7, f6, draw. So yeah, that was the main idea of this defense, is that if white pushes the a-pawn, we can do a Vancouver-like attack of it laterally. So I don't know if the player with the white pieces just sort of saw all of that in the game. I'm a little bit unsure as to how this game demonstrates that drawing technique, because that didn't happen in the game. I mean, white played rook c7 here, rook a3, rook c5, and thankfully for black, the white rook is on the 5th rank, so it can't sort of nestle itself on f6, and luckily it can't nestle itself on f5. So black's always got these counter-attacking chances of just sort of nabbing pawns and coming back again if the white king comes across. So let's look at how this game carried on. King f8. White now played rook e5 to cut off the black king. But I'd sort of messed around a bit. I don't think this was in the book, this variation. I was just sort of intrigued. What happens if black just starts... Sorry, if white just brings their king over, king f2. King e7, king e2. And we just activate the king. That's what we do. Just come and hassle the rook. Rook to e5. Come and hit the f-pawn. King defends the f-pawn. And we've just got a very active king there. Engine saying draw, draw, draw. So rook e5 was played in the game, and black can actually still just play king g7, which looks really passive, but it's fine. But in the game, the player with the black pieces hit out with f6. White decided not to take that, which is probably pretty sensible. Some swapping off went on, and the black king still got activated. Rook b6 was played, trying to swap the a-pawn for the g-pawn, which does eventually happen, but the black rook can now just go on a bit of a checking mission. I mean, rook takes a5 is drawn, it's fine, but black decided to just keep checking the white king, because the only way that the white king can approach the rook is to either come up to the 4th rank, so that black can take the h-pawn, or if it comes up all the way to the 5th rank, then we can snatch the a-pawn. So, I mean, something like, for example, if the white king ever ended up on e4, then we could take on a5, because after rook takes g6, we'll come back and win the h-pawn. That's sort of clearly drawn. So the white king couldn't really approach the rook, because as soon as it does, it's just sort of in an offside position, and then we take on a5. So black just kept not taking on a5, and they agreed a draw there. So that was the defensive technique. I mean, it looks like this extra space that white's got on the king side is good for them, but actually no, black can just do this Vancouver-like defense where we attack the passed pawn laterally. So one other game to show. This one is from 2014, and it ended up in the tragi-comedies section. It did end up as drawn, it should be drawn, but black failed to find the defensive technique that we saw in the previous game. So we'll get around to the critical position. I mean, there's a couple of things to discuss at the start, but it's really just about getting around to that critical point where black failed to sort of latch on to that Vancouver-like defensive idea, which they had a chance to do. What's going on here? Well, we've got the white pawns are already in this wave formation. The black pawns are not quite, but the white a-pawn is way back on a3. And I mean, there's always a dilemma, by the way, that this passed pawn, that the further forward it is, obviously the more it ties the defending side down to actually keeping an eye on it and making sure that it doesn't promote, basically. But then on the further back it is, the more space the the white rook has got, whilst the black rook sort of stays a bit crippled. So that's always the trade-off. But then if white doesn't push the a pawn, then black might just sort of say, well, I don't really care that my rook's crippled. You're not doing anything. You know, you do need to try and win this game. So it's generally at some point you're going to have to push it. Now in the game g6 was played, but black should just play h5 and just get that g4 square controlled, go for the wave formation, or in fact, as white sensibly brings their king forward, black can do the same, and rather than g6 and the wave formation here, we can just immediately play f6, and as white sort of tries to make progress, g5, and there we are, we're getting on with the usual defensive strike as white tries to make progress. You know, if the f pawn gets nabbed, we can swap on h4 and then take on a3 with check first as well, couldn't we? And then swap on h4, and it's just drawn. So that was probably the simplest way for black to go. They gave themselves problems by playing g6. Just more to think about. It's still drawn. White latched onto that with g4. King g7, king g2, these are all sensible moves. Rook comes round the back. And yeah, I mean, this rook a1 move is... It just means, says to white, well, how are you going to make progress here? Like, you know, if you bring your king in, I'm going to come and hassle your pawns, and you've got to do something about that. You know, we could see king g3, rook g1 check. In fact, yeah, white's sort of in a mess already there, aren't they? I think we might even end up with perpetual straight away. But even if there was some way that white could sort of get their king back, we could, you know, even if we don't nab the pawn, we can always just come back to a1. I've just got to be careful of your rook getting trapped there, haven't you? So yeah, you'd have to think about that. Rook takes h4 is okay, but you would have to think about it. Hang on a minute, is my rook getting trapped in there with the passed a pawn going on? But this passed a pawn is just so far away. And that's another reason you want to get it advanced up the board as white, is that black hasn't got time to start nicking pawns sort of in little caves, like h4 is almost the rook going in too deep, isn't it? It's actually fine, but could you imagine that over the board? King g2. Oh god, now I've got to analyse rook takes h4. One of those moves where you're like, I've got to analyse it, because if it's the best move, I've got to play it. But it's annoying, isn't it, when you have to calculate. Honestly, this who made us play chess, having to calculate? Anyway, white doesn't have any of that, and just plays a4. And there's the disadvantage of a4, is that it gives up the a3 square, and we're stopping the white king crossing the third rank. Now, Dvoretsky writes that in these sorts of positions, you want to get active with your king, because we saw in that previous game that gaining space on the king side doesn't actually achieve anything. g5 is what was played in the game. I guess black was trying to gain space and maybe entice h5, which was played, but they don't need to. They can just leave these pawns here, because black sort of has to play h5 anyway. They might have thought to push the h pawn instead. It doesn't get anywhere. Black can just swap, push the f pawn, and just check the white king until it relinquishes control of the h file, and then you can come over, and that's just drawn this white a pawn is too far away from promoting, so black's got time to grab the h pawn and work their way back out of the cave, I think I just called it a minute ago. The thing is, though, is that, I mean, g5 is the top engine move here, which is what was played in the game. I mean, how does white activate their king? If they were to play f3, for example, rook a2 check, king g3, black can play g5. And as far as I can tell, white's king's just stuck forever there. I think we're always going to have a king move, aren't we? And we can always just leave our rook on a2, where it's doing a fantastic job. You know, the white king's just... excuse me. The white king is just trapped on g3 and h3. Anyway, so g5 played in the game, h5. Let's get around to the critical point that illustrates this defensive idea that we saw in the previous game that wasn't latched onto. Rook a7, king g8, white pushes the a pawn, black hits the h pawn, king g3, rook g4 check, king h3, and then this is the bit where black made a mistake with rook a4. Okay, and now white apparently is objectively winning, although it still looks pretty hard from here if you ask me. But what white should have done is gone for that lateral attack idea whilst they could. So rook c4, and then if the a pawn is pushed, there you go, rook c6, king g3, king g7, white king tries to come in, rook e6. If the white rook goes to a8, king h7. If it doesn't, we could have gone king g8. And of course, if a7 is played, we're back to the cast iron draw. Something interesting, because rook c4 is fine, by the way, rook b4 is fine, rook d4, any of these moves are fine. Now rook e4 is also fine, but you're going to give yourself a headache. It's fine for different reasons. Rook a6, and then you hit the a pawn quick before white plays rook f6. We saw how that was a great place for the white rook to land. But with our rook on the e file, it can get hassled. f4. Now this is still drawn because we can shove the white king back to the second rank. King f8, I think, was the only drawing move there. It was. King f2, and then we have got time to come and grab the h pawn again. Now, do you really want to go down that path of, we don't really want to play moves, do we, where it's drawn for different reasons and then we've got to think about something else. Okay, so have a think about that sort of thing when you're trying to set up this, if you end up in this sort of position, you want to try and execute this lateral attack of the a pawn, also cutting off the white king. Don't put your rook on the e file because of that. It's going to get hassled, and all of a sudden you're looking around for different drawing ideas. I believe apparently it is drawn, but and also don't play this. This is what was played in the game, and now this is one for white. Although this game did end up as a draw, so let's go through it. A6, king g7, white pushes the f pawn. Rook a3 check, king g2. Rook a2 check, king comes over. Rook a4, king keeps coming over. King back to g8, black just waits, and the king can just keep coming over. That pawn cannot be taken, because as soon as it is, white can play rook b7, and if the h pawn is taken, then that's just a complete disaster because of a7, and you cannot stop rook b8 check followed by a8 equals queen. I mean, you can move your king, but then a8 equals queen straight away. So at this point, having grabbed the f pawn, black can't take the h pawn as well, so they'd have to come back to a4. But then you just play a7, and black's just paralysed. They've got no way to make progress. Their king's got to come off the 8th rank straight away. As soon as they do, none of their pawns can move. So white's winning plan is so simple. Black has no moves, so that would just be just gone. And all of that means is that black can't take the f pawn in this position, and sensibly didn't. They played king g7, threatening to take it. White keeps coming over. Rook takes f4, but that allows the white rook out. Black grabbed the h pawn as well. Rook b4 was played. Rook h3 check. King b2. We saw lots of messing around here, where I suppose it's a fight, isn't it? Over you will let me to the f file and the a file, sorry. And white's like, no, I won't let you to the a file. That's the dynamic going on here. Rook h1. Rook a4 played in the game. I investigated. I think a line I investigated here. So what about rook b2? We'll see rook a1 check, rook a2, rook back to e1. It'd be pretty similar. This is now just drawn. a7, rook back to e8, king b4, rook a8, and as the king comes in, the h pawn can get pushed. King makes contact with the a pawn. That the black rook's going to get lost, isn't it, very soon? But with cf6, king b7, rook takes a7, and we have a drawn version of rook versus pawn. So yeah, rook b2 didn't lead anywhere. I've got a feeling there's an absolutely incredible variation coming up in a minute. Just sort of engine madness, basically. No one's going to see this. It's just absurd. It's just entertainment. It's not anybody learning about chess, in my view. I'll show you it in a sec. So rook a4 played in the game. Rook a1 check. King b4. Rook b1 check. And then king c5 was played in the game, which apparently is excuse me, apparently the move that so I'm just going to pause my video. I've got a throat to clear. Right, sorry about that. So yeah, king c5 was played in the game, but apparently king a5 should have been played, and here's the sort of the absolutely mental engine line coming up. This is entertaining. But yeah, king a5 should have been played rather than king c5, because when black comes back, rook b8, we shift the rook out, and then black's only got one attempt at a draw here, which the engine thinks is drawn at this stage, but it changed its mind in a minute, and that's just to simply get their rook behind the h pawn and push it. A pawn is pushed, and black pushes the h pawn. Now, the winning line here, and it is winning, is the simple deflection, and we get a queen. And I'm not getting sidetracked by this. I haven't done any videos yet on queen versus rook. I might even remember to come back and do this one, but some grandmasters analysed this position and eventually found a win for white, all to do with the black rook stopping the white king coming across the c file, but it hasn't got enough squares on the c file to do it. And fascinating, I'm sure. I am interested in that eventually, but I haven't started on queen versus rook just yet. But that's how white should have gone about winning it. But if we go back to this position, you might be thinking, and I think quite a few normal people would be thinking, why do you have to like get involved in queen versus rook when you can just come to b8? You know, I mean, if black plays rook a8 there, we can just move our king forward and the h pawn's doomed. That's sort of clearly winning. So yeah, why not just do that? Okay, well here we go. Rook a8, king a6, h pawn gets pushed. Okay, we can bring the rook back to b2 to deal with that. And yeah, see if you pause the video for like, and go away for 3 days and see if you can work out black's next move. Rook c8, like quadruple exclamation mark or something. It's like, that looks really silly. That looks really, really silly because it allows rook b8. It does. It does look very silly, doesn't it? h2, take on c8. h1 equals queen. That's, we're a rook up now. Yeah, you are a rook up, but we have a perpetual. There's nothing that that white can do to stop that that perpetual. There's just no blocking there. Their queen and their rook are sort of too deep into enemy territory. Anyway, white didn't see all of that. What an idiot. And instead played king c5. So, I mean, I occasionally get to bits in the Dvoretsky book where certain moves are criticised, and for the idea of that being a tragicomedy, I mean, to be honest, to me, it's just absurd. It's absolutely absurd that anyone would see all of that stuff. King c5, just a perfectly natural move. I mean, maybe I'm just speaking for myself because I'm just not good enough, but for me, you know, you have to accept that sometimes in chess the analysis is just just beyond us. It's just certainly for me, it's something like that. It's just beyond me. You know, and I've had a couple of conversations with, I think I mentioned one in the past, with a guy I meet at congresses every now and again who says that this entire Dvoretsky book is just too hard. And, you know, you get to stuff like that and you think, okay, I think I see what you mean now on that particular line. Anyway, rook b8, rook f4. And it's like, black sort of defended this pretty well, to be honest. It's still completely winning for white at this stage. And then rook a4. So apparently white should have pushed the a pawn there. So engine reckons a7, and it's just gone. But rook a4 played, rook b8, a7 played now, and now it's just a draw again. Okay, white played rook a6, I guess trying to inhibit the mobilization. I mean, black wants to play this, don't they, to get their king active and have their king supporting this h-pawn in the rook and pawn coming up. But black just pushes the h-pawn anyway, king b6, and then as soon as the king's in front of the king's blocked the... I'll talk English eventually. The king's blocked the rook's route to f6, and you just got to be careful, obviously, not to take that f-pawn back and lose your rook to a discovered check. But the king's active now. Black rook's gone, and you might be wondering why white didn't take with the king there, thinking about it. I guess their king's just further away and we can just start advancing the pawns. So in the game, rook takes a7 was played, just trying to get the king closer. There it is, c6. Black does a bit of top-level shouldering, and basically black executes rook versus pawn extremely well. And reasonably soon after this, they agreed a draw. Well, they didn't agree a draw. White just played rook takes h2. There you go. So, you know, is this sort of position the most studied rook endgame in the history of chess? No, it's not. All the similar ideas are present, but a new idea is present. And that new idea is, although white's got lots of space on the king side, this e6 square being protected and the white pawn not quite advanced yet means that we can come and, in a Vancouver defense-like way, attack that that a pawn laterally, while simultaneously cutting off the white king. I don't think there's anything else interesting to say on that, and I shall stop it there.